Good morning, everybody. So my name is Dr. Oleka. I am a pediatric and adolescent gynecologist, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about gynecologic considerations for girls in sport, and I am so excited to talk to you guys about this because I have a pretty significant sports history. So I have played almost every single sport that's out there, ranging from ballet, bumper bowl. I was on a unicycling and juggling team, which is a real thing. We did have practice. Also gymnastics and tumbling. And then I was also a former varsity multi-sport athlete, playing soccer, cheerleading, cross country, and my two main sports were volleyball and track and field, where I was a former Division I track and field athlete. And you can see that's me over there in playing volleyball in high school, where I was a middle hitter. So none of my participation in sports would have been possible without Title IX. And so Title IX was established in 1972 in order to provide everyone with equal access to any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance, including sports. So by the 1980s, involvement of women and girls in sports had increased by 700%. So while we still have a far way to go, especially for girls of color, we have made incredible progress. 2 in 5 high school girls participate in sports as compared to 1 in 27 in the early 70s. And at the 2016 Rio Olympics, we all watched as woman after woman shattered records, broke barriers, and won 28 of the 46 gold medals awarded to the United States Olympics team. That's 60%. There's more, though, of a benefit to sports than just gold medals. So we also know that sports are a positive and enriching experience for physical, emotional, and mental development. It's also a wonderful way to encourage regular exercise throughout life and to set the stage for a physically active lifestyle. We also know that puberty is a pretty critical time period within a young girl's life, and that confidence tends to drop by about 30%. And what I like to call Pubescence, which is the mass exodus of girls from sports, begins. And so the Women's Sports Foundation says that by the age of 14, girls tend to be dropping out of sports at 2 times the rate as boys. And by 17, 51% of girls no longer play sports. And then when asked, they say they either didn't feel like they belonged in sports, or they really didn't feel like they were encouraged to continue to be athletic. Which is alarming because we know that puberty in girls leads to decreased confidence, and we know that sports increases confidence. In fact, we know that sports increases confidence, self-esteem, and positively influences concept of self and self-image during a critical time. In 2015 U.S. consumer data showed that women who had ages 18 to 24 who had participated in sports were more likely to be confident compared to those girls who did not. 61% of female executives said sports contributed to their career success. Dr. Sutton, who's an orthopedic surgeon at Yale University, said that sports taught her that success and failure are both acceptable. Pierre Gilardi, who's co-founder and executive creative producer of Refinery 21, which is an American digital media and entertainment website targeted towards young girls, said that learning from your mistakes and picking yourself up when you are literally or figuratively fall down definitely sets you up for dealing with the natural successes and failures of life. It's like learning a language. You train your brain differently, even if you don't end up using it. You learn skills that you keep with you for a lifetime. And for me, sports has taught me mental toughness, discipline, grit, and stick-with-itness. I know it's not a word, but I did make it up. It taught me resilience, and it also gave me the confidence to try and the foundational resilience necessary to constructively interpret and rise from failure. It instilled the energizing and powerful feeling of improving or succeeding in something simply because you made the decision, you showed up, and you consistently put in the effort. But there's still a lot that we don't yet know. Despite this decreasing gender gap in exercise participation, there is still a significant underrepresentation of women included in sports and exercise medicine research studies. Why? The menstrual cycle. It's seen as a complexity, in fact, a major barrier to the inclusion of women in sport and exercise medicine research. So much of the research that we have in exercise physiology has primarily included men, which makes it really hard to generalize these findings to women. This is crucial because there are certain unique things that female athletes will experience that can affect their pubertal development as well as their reproductive function. So there is a clear need to gain a better understanding of female physiology and to define the effects of the cyclical variations in hormones, both positive and negative, on athletic performance. I could obviously talk to you guys about this all day, but I don't have that kind of time. So I will briefly touch on the following things: pubertal delay in female athletes, menarchal delay or irregularities, use of the menstrual cycle to enhance athletic performance, menstrual suppression and manipulation of female athletes, and just general things to know as a pediatrician. So puberty is a 4 to 5 year process during which adolescents reach sexual maturity and become capable of reproduction. That is literally its ultimate purpose, and it generally marks the beginning of adolescence. Pubertal development after 8 years old is generally considered normal, and puberty is considered delayed if there is no breast development by 13, if there is no menses or menstrual cycles by 15 with secondary sexual characteristics, or if there is no menses greater than 3 years after breast development. Obviously, it's going to be thelarchy or breast development, and this is signified by breast budding and marks the onset of breast development. It's the most common physical sign that puberty is occurring and typically starts anywhere from 9 to 12 years old. Pubes is the development of pubic hair, which is the coarse hair in the pubic area, and typically follows breast development, although with 15% of girls, this can be the first sign of pubertal development. Spurts is the growth spurt or the peak height velocity. It's really where the acceleration increases in the rate of growth. Sometimes we'll see that the limbs will accelerate before the trunk, which is also why adolescents seem to be all hands and feet. But eventually, later in puberty, the growth becomes trunkal and they eventually catch up. Squirts is going to be your menarche, menses, the menstrual cycle, insert any other variety of names which are used to describe this process, but it's when fluid containing mostly blood and tissue flows out of the body from the uterus through the vagina. And this usually occurs about 2 years after the onset of puberty, which is most commonly going to be 2 years after breast development. So the average age for menstrual cycles is usually going to be around 12 years old. So we can see that physical maturation and growth is this complex and dynamic process that requires this elaborate orchestration of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal, or the HPO, axis. And genetically, we know that someone is going to express their prepubertal predispositions based on favorable environmental conditions. And this is going to be, each sport is going to have its own unique way that it exerts its influences on biological maturations. And that could be sport-related specific character, technical skills and training methods, or just the stage of growth and sexual maturation that the individual is at the time of their participation in the sport. So sometimes you ask yourself which came first, the delay or the sport? Because we know that girls who tend to be of shorter stature are going to tend to accelerate more in sports that cater to shorter stature, like gymnastics, whereas girls who maybe tend to have their growth spurt a little bit earlier may tend to be catered to a little bit more in sports that favor a higher stature, like basketball or volleyball. So we know that specific sports favor the early maturing, whereas other sports, such as gymnastics, offer an advantage to the later or the delayed individuals. Possible unfavorable environmental conditions do include, though, intensive physical exercise and stress. And so the impact of stress and intense physical training on growth really depends on the combined effects of how hard they're training, how often they're training, and how long they're training. Girls training for about 12 hours a week in sports like rowing, track, and swimming, on average for 4 years, really didn't have a difference in their height velocity. We saw that female swimmers who trained for 8 hours each week had normal heights and normal height velocities after a 2 to 3 year follow-up. But gymnasts now, they train much more intensely than they have in the previous years. Now gymnasts will start training at about 6.5 to 7.5, and they train for about 30 hours a week. In the 80s, that was about 20 hours a week. In the 70s, 15 hours a week. So since Title IX, we can see that we are now pushing our girls athletically to a place where we really haven't been before. We know that intense athletic training of 18 hours a week is capable of attenuating growth. Less than 15 hours a week does not show menstrual disturbances or a delay in sexual maturation. The important thing is that if there are menstrual disturbances or a delay in sexual maturation is observed, have them evaluated by a pediatric and adolescent gynecologist or an obstetrician and gynecologist, and this is encouraged and recommended. Why? Though I won't go through the entire differential diagnosis, the differential diagnosis for delayed puberty is pretty broad and extensive. And so it's necessary and important to refrain from the assumption that pubertal delay in a female athlete is just due solely to the fact that she's a competitive athlete, without first ruling out other possible causes. So despite the broad differential, we do know that pubertal development and sexual maturation have been observed in a variety of sports, mainly gymnastics, dancing, and long-distance running. The delay is in the initiation of puberty, however, and not the progression through puberty. And it's going to be more pronounced in sports that require strict dietary restrictions that result in a higher energy expenditure in the presence of a deficient energy input. So essentially, timing of energy deficiency, length of energy deficiency, and severity of energy deficiency are going to determine the type of pubertal involvement or delay. So let's talk about menstrual absence or irregularities in female athletes. And I want to ask a question, or a statement, we'll say. It's normal to have irregular periods as a female athlete, yes or no? Uh-oh, okay. All right, so it seems like majority think it's false, which is true, so it's false. That was confusing. All right, so it is not normal to have irregular cycles as a female athlete. So absence of the menstrual cycle, which is known as amenorrhea, in a female athlete that otherwise has all the necessary organs and hormones to have a menstrual cycle is unhealthy, abnormal, and dangerous. Sports that require strict control and regulation of energy intake or food, while also demanding high energy output, are of particular concern. Primary amenorrhea is defined as no menarche by age 15, and only 3 in 1,000 girls will have their period after 15 and a half years old. Primary amenorrhea in collegiate athletes at baseline is found to be about 7% overall, and this increases to 22% in sports like cheerleading, diving, and gymnastics. Secondary amenorrhea refers to an absence of 3 consecutive cycles post-menarche, and that's about 2 to 5% in collegiate women baseline, which increases up to 65 to 69% in dancers and long-distance runners. So it happens, but it's not normal. Mary Cain is a professional American middle distance runner, and at the World Championships in Moscow in 2013, she became the youngest American athlete ever to represent the United States at a World Championships meet. She was 17 years old at the time. In November of 2019, she wrote a New York Times opinion piece highlighting her experience with Nike's Oregon project, which is now closed. She wrote, "After being cooked meager meals by an assistant coach, she often had to eat more in the privacy of her condo room, nervous he would hear her open the wrappers of the energy bars she had there." After months of dieting and frustration, Cain found herself choosing between training with the best team in the world or potentially developing osteoporosis or even infertility. She lost her period for 3 years and broke 5 bones. She went from being a once-in-a-generation Olympic hopeful to having suicidal thoughts. At the beginning of the talk, I spoke about how sports can generate confidence and increase self-image and positive feelings of self and outlook on life. And so when stories like this arise, we really have to take a step back and look at ourselves and our goals and our athletes in the eye and say, are we really building confidence here? So there's a minimum weight for height and a critical lean to fat mass ratio that's required for menarche. There's a Frisch theory that says that attainment of critical percentage of body fat lowers the metabolic rate and induces a sensitization of the hypothalamus to the gonadal steroids. The HPO system is actually intact by 14 weeks of gestation, but it's downregulated in the prepubertal childhood years. We don't yet know what wakes it up from its quiet slumber, but we do know that the pulsatile release of gonadotropins is responsible for ovarian stimulation, maturation, and the synthesis of gonadal or sex steroid hormones. Undernutrition and low body fat and an altered ratio of lean mass to body fat can delay normal sexual maturation, growth, and development, as well as onset of menarche. Adequate nutrition leads to adequate available energy, whereas inadequate nutrition leads to an energy deficiency, meaning there's not enough energy left over after purposeful exercise has occurred for the vital and basic physiological processes. Energy deficiency leads to a functional hypothalamic hypogonadism in female athletes, which means that hormonal production is low, decreased, or absent. Why? So low availability of metabolic fuel or energy causes the body to move fuel and its focus away from reproduction and growth in order to maintain basic physiological processes in an effort to conserve fuel. It's literally in survival mode. And so we don't want to be reproducing or growing during survival mode. The movement or repartitioning of metabolic fuel results in the suppression of reproductive function and growth, and this is clinically seen as menstrual cycle dysfunction and subsequent low bone mineral density or mass. This is why Mary Cain lost her period for 3 years and broke 5 bones. Her body simply did not have the fuel it needed to power both her basic physiologic needs and her intense training and workouts. Signs of low energy availability can be indicated by low energy stores, a BMI less than 17.5 kilograms per meter squared, and adolescents who are less than 85% of their body weight. It may not always be as obvious. The body weight may not particularly be low, so more detailed information regarding food intake and energy expenditure is necessary to help to diagnose this. Physiologic signs can be found in a reduced resting metabolic rate, or RMR, low T3, or ratio of measured RMR over predicted RMR less than 90, which an experienced sports nutritionist and dietitian exercise physiologist can help with these assessments. So we know we've heard a lot about female athlete triad, which I call the triad because the acronym FAT just does not feel appropriate, and relative energy deficiency in sports, which we know as REDS. So the two are similar. So they both call attention to the importance of adequate energy intake to prevent negative health outcomes associated with participation in sport and exercise. They both include point system algorithms for risk stratification, decision-making on clearance and return to play, as well as noting that early intervention is essential to prevent progression to serious problems. But they do differ. Female athlete triad focuses on girls and women. It's focused on low energy availability and associated clinically relevant outcomes. And it focuses on the triad of disordered eating, menstrual dysfunction, and bone loss. REDS is a little bit different. So REDS is now incorporating women and men, and it calls for more research on the impact of race, ethnicity, and disability. It's focused more so on energy deficiency relative to a balance between dietary energy intake and energy expenditure required to support not just clinically relevant outcomes, but more so like a homeostasis, health in the activities of daily living, growing, and sporting activities. It's not a triad, but rather a syndrome that affects many aspects of physiological function. Here you can see the female athlete triad schematic, and so you have these black bidirectional arrows. And basically the bidirectional arrows are showing that there is a continuum. It's along a continuum showing that there's reversibility throughout the processes. And you can see in the red, there's an arrow going from low energy availability down to osteoporosis and down to functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, showing that there's a causality of low energy that leads to low bone mineral density as well as menstrual dysfunction. There's also a unidirectional arrow that goes from menstrual dysfunction to osteoporosis, showing that there's also a causality of abnormal menses or low estrogen that leads to this menstrual cycle, that leads to this low bone mineral density. Sustained low energy can impact cardiovascular, endocrinologic, reproductive, and skeletal health. REDS essentially has energy deficiency in the center, and it basically shows that energy deficiency is the direct cause of multiple physiologic abnormalities, such as gastrointestinal abnormalities, cardiovascular, metabolic, and it has specific things that it says it can lead to, such as decreased muscle strength, impaired judgment, as well as irritability, etc. So it kind of takes out the estrogen as the middleman, because now we're including men, and looks at it more as an energy deficiency causality. Energy status must be normalized primarily through modifications of diet and exercise. And so the best way to do that is not necessarily to start them on a birth control pill to regulate their cycles, but is to restore or normalize their body weight. And this is going to lead to improved bone health training and successful resumption of menses. And this can occur either through increase in dietary energy intake or a decrease in energy expenditure or both. And this can be deduced with a sports dietitian and a mental health provider. However, if they are sexually active, there is a risk of unplanned pregnancy, and so contraception obviously is going to be recommended at that time. Throughout the treatment process, recovery of energy status can take days or weeks, recovery of menstrual status can take months, and recovery of bone mineral density can take years, if at all. So how can we use the menstrual cycle, though, to enhance our athletic performance? In 2019, October, I published a commentary article in the Journal of Pediatric and Adolescent Gynecology entitled "The Use of the Menstrual Cycle to Enhance Female Sports Performance and to Decrease Sports-Related Injury." And in it, I stated, there is a body of research emerging that highlights that strength training is more advantageous in the first half of the menstrual cycle because the body adapts and recovers better. How is that so? Ovarian-wise, the menstrual cycle is divided into follicular phase, ovulatory phase, and a luteal phase. In the follicular phase, it's estrogen dominant. Estrogen means we have a greater effect in muscle mass, strength, and power. We have higher pain tolerance. When estrogen increases, our recovery is efficient, and it's the ideal environment for muscle growth. Ovulation, our muscles are warmer, we are hungrier, and our strength levels are high. We have a high shear force generation capacity, and if we're trying to attempt a PR, the time is now. Ludial phase, progesterone dominant. Our energy levels are low, our appetite's increased, we're craving carbs, but our body isn't using them because it's burning fat, so our muscles fatigue easier. Our ligaments and our tendons are relaxed, and we have increased risk of injury. This is also not the best time to start a diet or a healthy lifestyle change because most women tend to have a hard time sticking with it during this time period because of the cravings. So what happens when you track your menstrual cycle? Championships. The United States women's national soccer team in 2019 tracked their menstrual cycles and their symptoms, and their coaches tailored their workouts to the different parts of their menstrual cycle. Not only did they win the World Cup, they also had a history-making performance. But not everyone will be able to benefit from their menstrual cycles. So over the past year, several notable female athletes have publicly discussed the impact that their menstrual cycles have had on their athletic performance. At the 2016 Summer Olympics, Chinese Olympic medalist Fu Yanhui, who's a swimmer, remarked that her race was impacted by having her period because she felt tired and weak. At the 2016 Australian Open, the #1 British tennis player, Heather Watson, cited girl things as a reason as to why she was feeling fatigued during competition. USA gymnast Ali Reisman discussed the impact of her period on competition in Cosmopolitan Story, describing how she had to compete in gymnastics tournaments while battling her sometimes debilitating periods that would make it hard to get out of bed. So there are two types of groups who request birth control or hormonal therapy to help regulate or suppress menses. The ones who prefer it, they don't have any abnormalities in their period, they just don't want to deal with their period, and they prefer to be without it. And the ones who need it, so they have the true menstrual dysfunction or they need it for contraception. Menstrual difficulties have been described in 5 to 20% of vigorously exercising females, 12% of swimmers and cyclists, 44% of ballet dancers, 50% of female athletes, and 51% of endurance runners. There is no medical indication for menstruation to occur monthly. There is no evidence that suppression of menses affects athletic performance, and a third of adolescents who use birth control pills do so for non-contraceptive reasons. So menstrual suppression is becoming much more common among contracepting adolescents. This can be achieved in terms of menstrual suppression and manipulation, can be achieved with continuous hormonal therapy, which can either be given through combined birth control pills, a vaginal ring, progesterone-only options such as Depo-Provera or the levonorgestrel intrauterine devices. Progesterone-only pills and the etonogestrel implant are not typically recommended for suppression because there's a lot of breakthrough bleeding and they don't generally tend to, and a low amenorrhea rate essentially. Transdermal patch does have an increased systemic estrogen level, and so this can lead to a slightly increased VTE risk, and so it's generally not used as first line. So things to know as a pediatrician: you want to be knowledgeable about the positive benefits of sports involvement for adolescent girls. You want to watch for concerning weight loss and disordered eating. You want to be leery of excessive weekly exercise that's over 15 to 18 hours per week, especially in the setting of menstrual dysfunction and disordered eating. You want to refrain from the assumption that pubertal delay in a female athlete is due solely to competitive athletics without first ruling out other possible causes. And you want to know, which seems like most of us do, that it is not normal for female athletes to have absent or irregular menstrual cycles just because they are athletes. Thank you.